The wind howled across the desolate Montana frontier, cutting through the trees like a blade, dragging the last breath from the dying night. Snow fell in thick silence. Beneath the twisted limbs of an ancient pine, a man stood motionless. His figure, wrapped in a worn military coat, was barely visible against the white shroud. In front of him, a crude wooden cross. Nothing more. Just a name carved by shaking hands: Mary Granger. Thomas Granger didn't cry. The tears had dried somewhere between Appomattox and this frozen wasteland he now called home. He knelt briefly, pressed 2 fingers to the snow-covered earth, then stood again with the same mechanical stillness of a man who'd lost more than he could ever name. His eyes, pale and hard like glacier ice, lifted toward the treeline. Then a scream.
Thin, distant, desperate.
He turned his head. Another scream, then silence. The kind of silence that screamed louder than any human throat ever could. Without thinking, Thomas grabbed his rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and trudged forward. Snow creaked beneath his boots. The forest around him felt alive, and not in a comforting way. Branches snapped under the weight of snow, as if some unseen presence moved just ahead. He didn't know who had screamed, but that didn't matter. The war had stripped him of many things, but not the instinct to run toward trouble. It took nearly 15 minutes of hard hiking before he spotted the sagging remains of a farmhouse, half buried in snow, its windows broken, its porch sagging like a drunkard's shoulders. He paused at the edge of a copse, listening.
Then he saw it.
A woman. She lay curled against a fence post, her hands over her head. 2 men, unshaven, one with a crude whip, stood over her. One raised his arm and struck. Thomas stepped out from the trees. "Enough," he said. Both men froze. The one with the whip turned, mouth half open. Thomas raised his rifle. "Back away." "You got no business here, stranger," said the man with the whip, stepping forward, trying to assert confidence. Thomas didn't move. "You hit her again, and I'll drop you where you stand." The man looked at the gun, then at his companion. Something passed between them. Fear or calculation. They turned and retreated toward the tree line, the one in the back shouting over his shoulder. "She's ours. Ain't the last you'll see of us." The snow swallowed them. The woman did not move. Thomas approached slowly, crouched beside her. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. No answer. Her face was swollen, lips split. Her dress torn, stained. Barefoot in the snow. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what they'd done. He simply wrapped his coat around her and lifted her into his arms.
She didn't resist.
She was too light, like someone half forgotten by the world. The walk back felt longer, her breath barely noticeable against his chest. When they reached the cabin, he kicked the door open and stoked the fire to life. He laid her gently on the bed, his bed, and wrapped her in furs. She moaned once, almost in protest. Then silence again. By morning she was still alive. Thomas didn't sleep. He sat in the corner, near the fire, rifle across his knees. Watching. Waiting. When her eyes finally opened, she flinched.
He didn't speak.
Just stood slowly, poured a tin cup of water, and set it on the table beside her. She stared at him, uncertain, then turned her face to the wall. Days passed. She didn't give a name. She barely touched the food he left beside the bed. But he continued, cooking, checking her wounds, changing the dressings without a word. The bruises began to fade. The swelling around her eyes softened. Still, she remained silent. On the 4th night, a blizzard struck. Snow crashed against the windows. The wind screamed like the dying. He pulled more wood from the stockpile, fed the fire constantly. The room shrank in on itself, warm but small, claustrophobic. That night, she whispered for the first time, "My name is Eleanor." He didn't turn from the fire. "Thomas." No more was said. In the mornings, she sat on the edge of the bed, watching him move around the cabin, boiling water, cleaning tools, sharpening knives. His movements were precise, practiced. She noticed the scars on his forearms, the hollow under his eyes, the stiffness in his gait. One afternoon, she reached for the stew he'd left beside her. Her hand trembled. He didn't help. She spilled half of it onto the blanket. He said nothing, just cleaned it up. She began to speak in pieces. Short sentences. Facts, not stories. Her husband had died in a logging accident last year. She was remarried weeks later to his cousin, at the urging of her in-laws. The new husband, cruel and entitled, beat her often. The family joined in. No one intervened. Not even the preacher. They said I belonged to him. Like a cow. Or a dog. Thomas didn't reply. His silence seemed to comfort her more than any platitudes could have. She flinched at sudden sounds. A dropped log. A door creaking open. But she began to move more freely. She helped gather snow for water, stirred the stew, watched him from the window when he chopped wood. Once, she tried to sweep the floor but collapsed from weakness. He caught her before she hit the ground. Neither spoke of it. One night, the wind eased. The fire burned low. Eleanor sat at the edge of the hearth, wrapped in his old coat. "Why are you out here?" she asked. Thomas stared into the flames. Trying to forget. She waited. "My wife died last winter. Fever. Couldn't get medicine in time. I buried her under a pine tree. Then I stayed." He didn't say more.
Didn't need to.
That night, she cried. Soft, like someone trying not to be heard. He heard anyway. He stood, approached, and placed another blanket over her shoulders. She didn't look up. Another week passed. She walked on her own, slowly but deliberately. Her voice returned, low but steady. She asked about the tools on the wall, the hunting rifle, the carved chessboard tucked away in a corner. He told her stories, short ones, about his childhood on a Pennsylvania farm, about the war, about the friends who never made it home. "I used to think I'd die in a trench," he said. "Turns out, burying the woman you love hurts more." She touched his hand, lightly, then pulled away. One morning, as dawn rose, she stood beside him as he chopped firewood. Her hands were pale, weak. She lifted a small axe and tried to mimic his swing. It was awkward, inefficient, but he said nothing. That night, as another storm moved in, they sat near the fire again. She placed the old music box on the table, a relic she had managed to keep. The melody was broken, uneven. Still, she stood and offered her hand. "Dance with me." Thomas hesitated, then stood. They moved slowly. No rhythm, just movement. Her hand in his. The smell of wood smoke. The creak of floorboards. For the first time in months, they both smiled. It didn't last long, but it was enough. Outside, the wind picked up again. Branches scratched the windows like claws. Somewhere in the distance, a raven cried. And in the silence that followed, they both knew the past had not yet released them. But for one brief night, they had stepped outside its shadow. Together. Thomas woke before the sun, as he always did. But this morning the air felt heavier, dense with something unspoken. The snowfall had slowed to a gentle dust, and a thin silver light crept through the cracks in the log walls. Across the room, Eleanor still slept, her breath steady now, no longer haunted by the sharp starts of trauma. But sleep did not come easily to Thomas anymore, not since the war, not since Mary's death, and especially not since he'd found Eleanor in the snow, broken and afraid. He stepped outside. The forest was quiet, but it wasn't peace he heard, it was pause. A stillness that always came before disruption. The birds were silent. Even the wind held its breath. He scanned the tree line with practiced eyes, a soldier's gaze. He'd learned long ago to trust that silence could mean danger. His instincts were rarely wrong. Later that morning, Eleanor was folding blankets when she noticed the lines etched deeper in his face. The way his jaw clenched. She didn't ask what was wrong. She had learned, as he had, that silence often spoke more clearly than words. That evening, just after supper, trouble came back. A crash of glass. The window near the table exploded inward. Shards rained down like ice. Thomas dove for his rifle while Eleanor screamed and ducked beneath the table. Two silhouettes appeared at the door, kicking it in. The firelight caught their faces. One of them the man with the whip. "Thought we told you she was ours," he snarled, raising a pistol. Thomas didn't hesitate. The rifle bucked once, a blast of thunder in the small space. The man at the door fell, screaming and grabbing his leg. The other bolted, firing wildly into the night. Wood splintered above Thomas's head. He shoved the table aside, reached down, and pulled Eleanor to her feet. "Get to the back room." But she didn't run. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but anger. Her fists were clenched. The sound of horses galloping off vanished into the distance, leaving only the echo of gunfire behind. They were gone.
For now.
Thomas locked the door. His heart pounded like a war drum, but his voice remained steady. "They'll come back. Not alone next time." She didn't reply. She just nodded and began sweeping the broken glass into a pile. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. Neither did Eleanor. They sat by the fire in silence, wrapped in separate blankets, sharing the same flickering fear. The knowledge that peace had only been borrowed, and the price had come due. By morning, Thomas had made a decision. "We need help," he said flatly. "There's someone out in the hills. A man I know. Someone who won't ask questions." Eleanor looked up, surprised. "A friend?" He hesitated. "Of sorts." He left that afternoon, armed and cloaked, vanishing into the gray haze of forest and fog. Eleanor watched from the window until he disappeared, then turned back to the silence of the cabin. She tended the fire, mended what she could, but the hours dragged like chains behind her. Her mind raced. Every creak in the floorboards, every snap of wind against the logs, made her flinch. But she didn't run. Not again. 2 days later, Thomas returned, with a stranger. The man was tall, wrapped in a bearskin coat, with sharp, unreadable eyes. His face was marked by war paint faded into the natural lines of his skin. He said nothing when he entered. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. There was something ancient about him, quiet and dangerous. "This is Red Elk," Thomas said. "We fought together once. He saved my life during a raid." Red Elk nodded once at Eleanor, then sat near the hearth without a word. He watched the fire as if it told a story only he could understand. Eleanor didn't trust him. Not yet. But she trusted Thomas, and that was enough. The next morning, Red Elk took her into the clearing. She was confused at first, unsure of his intent, but Thomas simply nodded. "Go with him." He handed her a carved wooden stick. Red Elk drew a line in the snow. Then another. He moved slowly, gesturing, never speaking. Teaching. At first, she was clumsy, unsure of the purpose. But Red Elk's patience never wavered. Over the days that followed, she learned to swing a knife, to move silently, to aim with calm precision. Thomas watched from the porch. He didn't intervene, didn't offer encouragement. But his silence was different now, not cold, not distant. It was full of something else. Pride, perhaps. Or admiration. Each day they trained, and each night they gathered near the fire. Red Elk said little. Thomas less. But Eleanor began to speak. Not about her past, but about the present, what she was learning, what she feared, what she hoped to become. "I'm not the same woman you carried through the snow," she said one night. Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "I don't want to be her again." Thomas looked at her and nodded just once. "You won't be." Together, they fortified the cabin. Red Elk laid traps in the woods, hidden pits, trip lines, sharpened stakes. Eleanor practiced loading the rifle. Her hands still trembled, but less each time. One night, the three of them sat around the fire sharing dried meat. Eleanor laughed at a joke Thomas barely remembered telling. Red Elk cracked a rare smile. The room felt different, less like a refuge from the world, more like a world of its own. A small, fragile one, but real. Later, as the wind picked up again, Eleanor found the music box on the shelf and wound it gently. The broken tune warbled through the cabin like a ghost's lullaby. She turned to Thomas. "Dance with me?" He blinked. A moment passed. Then he stood and stepped into her arms. There were no words. Just the soft scrape of boots on wood, the creak of beams, the music box's uneven song. Her head rested on his chest. He closed his eyes. They didn't speak afterward. They didn't need to. The next day, Thomas noticed tracks in the snow. Horses. Multiple.
Fresh.
They're close, he told Red Elk, who nodded grimly. They prepared for the worst. Eleanor packed ammunition. Thomas sharpened his hunting knife. Red Elk vanished into the forest without explanation, returning at dusk with news. 5 riders, he said, finally breaking his silence. His voice was deep, low, like stone rolling through a cave. They carry fire. Thomas looked at Eleanor. She didn't flinch. Then we fight, she said. And so, the final days before the storm passed in tense silence. Every door braced, every weapon readied. Eleanor stood at the window, watching snow drift down in lazy spirals. Once, she caught her reflection in the glass, eyes focused, shoulders straight. She didn't recognize the woman she saw. That was a good thing. That night, as the fire burned low, she sat beside Thomas on the bench. Outside, the wind whispered secrets through the trees. She leaned into his shoulder. I was afraid every day for so long, she said quietly. But now,
I'm not.
His hand found hers. Neither am I. In the quiet that followed, neither one dared to speak the truth they both felt, that this might be the last night either of them would see. But they didn't need to. They had come too far, survived too much. Whatever tomorrow held, they would meet it standing. The morning of the reckoning arrived cloaked in silence. No birds. No wind. Even the trees stood still, as if nature itself waited with bated breath. Frost covered every surface in a sheen of glassy white. Inside the cabin, Thomas checked the rifle once more, fingers moving with steady precision. Eleanor stood beside him, calm, her face pale but resolute. She tied her hair back with a leather cord, her eyes fixed on the door. They'll come at dawn, Red Elk had said the night before, when the sun blinds you. And so, they waited. Red Elk was already outside, hidden among the trees, his bow in hand, eyes scanning the hills. He moved like smoke, silent and unseen, every motion purposeful. He did not fight for them. He fought because he had once known cruelty in another form, long before Eleanor's pain, and he refused to see it repeated. Thomas glanced at Eleanor. Stay behind the stove until I call. She shook her head.
No.
He stared at her for a long moment. In her eyes, he saw not defiance, but conviction. Something had hardened inside her over these past weeks. She was no longer the woman he'd carried through the snow. The first sound was a hoofbeat, then another, distant but growing louder. Thomas moved to the window. 5 riders emerged from the treeline, just as Red Elk had said. Each one armed. The leader, the man with the whip, rode at the front. His leg was bound in a crude splint, his face twisted in rage. They came, Eleanor said flatly. Thomas nodded. Then we finish this. The riders circled the cabin, calling out threats, demanding Eleanor be returned. She belongs to us, the leader shouted. You're harboring stolen property, Granger. Thomas opened the door, rifle raised. She doesn't belong to anyone. A shot rang out. The bullet missed, striking the porch post beside his head. Thomas dove behind the doorway, returned fire. The shot caught one rider in the shoulder, knocking him off his horse. Eleanor moved fast, grabbing ammunition, loading the second rifle. She handed it to Thomas, without hesitation. Another shot shattered a window. Red Elk's arrow whistled from the trees, finding its mark. Another rider fell. The battle descended into chaos. Smoke rose as torches were thrown. One struck the edge of the cabin, flames licking at the roof. Eleanor grabbed a pail of water and doused it while Thomas held the door. Red Elk struck again, disappearing between fir trunks like a ghost. A rider dismounted and rushed the porch, axe in hand. Thomas met him there. The two clashed, wood against steel. Thomas grunted, parried, then drove his knife upward into the man's gut. Blood spilled. The rider collapsed. Thomas staggered back inside, breathing hard. They're pushing in. They won't, Eleanor said, voice fierce. She lifted the rifle, aimed through the broken window, and fired. A scream echoed across the snow. Only two remained now, the leader and one final rider, both pinned behind trees. The leader shouted into the trees, voice trembling. You think she's worth dying for, Granger? She ain't nothing but a broken thing. Eleanor stepped outside before Thomas could stop her. I'm not broken, she said. Not anymore. She fired. The leader's shoulder snapped back as the bullet struck. He screamed, dropped his weapon, and fell to one knee. The final rider bolted, disappearing into the woods, leaving the leader behind, gasping in the snow. Thomas approached him slowly, rifle still raised. You come back here again, he said, and I'll bury you myself. The man didn't answer, just crawled away, bleeding and humiliated, leaving a trail across the snow. It was over. Thomas turned to Eleanor. She lowered the rifle, breath visible in the cold air. Her hands trembled now, but her eyes remained steady. Inside, Red Elk stood at the edge of the forest, nodding once before vanishing without a word. His debt paid, his part in the story complete. By evening, the fire had been rebuilt, the broken windows patched with heavy hides. The snow outside had taken on a strange silence, less ominous now, more like exhalation. The world, perhaps, had decided they had earned one more night of peace. Thomas sat at the table, his arm in a sling, his face bruised. Eleanor knelt nearby, cleaning his wounds with a cloth warmed in tea. You saved me, he said softly. No, she replied. We saved each other. A long silence stretched between them, warm and full of meaning. She stood, crossed the room, and retrieved her music box. She wound it slowly, carefully, setting it on the table. The melody stuttered to life, still broken, still uneven, but beautiful in its imperfection. He looked at her. What will you do now? She considered the question, then smiled faintly. I'll stay if you want me to. He didn't answer right away, just stood and held out his hand. She took it. The days that followed were quieter. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb. Eleanor began repairing the damage, sewing curtains from leftover cloth, restoring the old furniture, tending to the small patch of frozen earth where she hoped to plant come spring. Thomas hunted less, spoke more. He laughed again, though it came cautiously, like a bird unsure if the sky would hold its wings. One morning, she stood alone at the pine tree where Mary was buried. She placed a small bundle of wildflowers at its base, dried and faded, but still intact. I never knew her, she whispered, but I'm grateful for her. She left enough love in him to save someone like me. She closed her eyes, the wind tugging at her coat. Behind her, Thomas waited. He didn't speak, only stood near, as he always did, offering presence instead of words. When she turned, she took his hand again. Later that evening, as the sun bled orange through the trees, they sat side by side on the porch. No words, just shared breath and the creak of the old chair beneath them. The horizon stretched wide before them, snow-covered and endless. A frontier of memory and survival. But they were not the same people who had faced it alone. In the quiet that followed, Thomas looked over at her. You're not a ghost anymore, he said. No, she replied. Neither are you. They sat long into the night, listening to the forest breathe. They knew the world could turn cruel again. The past would never vanish. The scars would not fade entirely. But they had earned this stillness, this moment, and perhaps for the first time in years, that was enough. As the firelight flickered through the windows, casting their shadows long and intertwined on the wooden walls, a whisper of spring rode the wind. Not yet, but close. Close enough to believe in. To the viewer, if you've stayed through this story, thank you. If it stirred something in you, hope, sorrow, strength, let that live on. Stories like this remind us that even in the harshest winters, there is warmth to be found. In courage, in kindness, in love born not of perfection, but of perseverance. If this tale meant something to you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And share it, because someone out there may need to hear it more than you know. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, shy and hesitant, like someone afraid of overstaying their welcome. The snow melted in patches, revealing damp earth and broken twigs. Streams that had frozen stiff now gurgled with life, and crows returned to the skies, their black wings cutting through pale blue. At the edge of the clearing, buds formed on the bare trees. Life, after a long silence, had begun whispering again. Thomas built a fence around the cabin. Nothing grand, just enough to mark space, to say this is ours now. He worked in long hours, sleeves rolled, sweat beading on his forehead, though the chill hadn't fully left the air. Eleanor worked alongside him. She learned to hammer, to measure, to cut clean lines into rough timber. Neither of them said what it meant. They didn't need to. Some things speak loudest without being named. The cabin felt different too. Where once it had echoed with loneliness, now it breathed with quiet rhythm. Two people moving in step, building something that might last. Eleanor planted seeds in a small garden bed beside the porch. Beans, potatoes, even a few wild herbs she'd gathered in the forest. She didn't know if they'd take, but she planted them anyway. It wasn't about certainty.
It was about trying.
One evening, as dusk settled low and gold across the treetops, Eleanor found Thomas sitting by the fire with an envelope in his hands. Worn, creased, sealed with a faded red wax. He didn't notice her at first. His gaze was fixed on the past. "What's that?" she asked gently, approaching. He looked up, startled, as if pulled from another world. "A letter I wrote after Mary died. I never sent it." Eleanor sat beside him, silent, waiting. "I wrote it to her sister," he said. "But I didn't know what to say. How do you explain that someone just stopped being there?" He stared into the flames, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. "Do you want to read it?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not anymore." He leaned forward and dropped the letter into the fire. The paper curled, blackened, then disappeared in a brief flash of orange. Some grief needs to be let go, not spoken. The next day brought visitors, 2 riders from a nearby settlement, wary but not hostile. They'd heard of the gunfire weeks ago, wanted to know what had happened. Thomas spoke little, but enough. Eleanor stood behind him, silent, her posture firm. "We're fine now," Thomas said. "We're not expecting more trouble." The riders exchanged looks, then nodded. "Word gets around. Folks'll know not to come poking." When they left, Eleanor watched them disappear into the trees, then turned to Thomas. "We're not hiding anymore."
"No," he said.
"We're not." The seasons shifted. Rain replaced snow. Grass pushed through the soil. The garden began to sprout. Eleanor beamed the day the first green leaf unfurled from the dirt. It wasn't much, but it was proof. Life had decided to return. One night, thunder rolled in from the mountains. Eleanor woke with a start, the room lit by lightning. Thomas lay beside her, sleeping soundly, one arm resting loosely around her waist. She listened to the rain beating the roof, steady and relentless. The old Eleanor might have wept at the sound, remembering nights spent curled in corners, afraid of storms she couldn't escape. But this storm was different. She was no longer powerless. She was no longer alone. She pressed closer to him and let sleep carry her gently back. The next morning brought something unexpected. A child, no more than 10, stood at the edge of the clearing. Mud-covered, shivering, eyes wide with terror. Eleanor spotted him from the window and rushed out, a blanket in hand. He didn't speak. He simply clutched the fabric tight as she wrapped it around him. Thomas emerged with bread and a canteen of water. "Where's your family?"
Thomas asked.
The boy shook his head. It took days before the boy, Daniel, spoke more than a few words. They learned his parents had been killed by raiders on the trail west. He'd escaped into the forest and wandered for days before finding their cabin. Thomas wanted to take him to the settlement, but Eleanor disagreed. "He doesn't need more strangers," she said. "He needs someone steady."
Thomas considered that.
"Are you saying we keep him?" "I'm saying we don't send him away until he's ready." Daniel stayed. He was quiet, watchful. But as days passed, he began to mimic Thomas, walking behind him during chores, picking up tools, learning to whittle wood. At night, he sat near Eleanor while she mended clothes or stirred stew. One evening, she caught him humming the broken tune of her music box. It nearly made her cry. They didn't try to become a family. They simply became one. Red Elk returned once, silent as ever. He stood in the tree lean at dusk, watching the cabin. Thomas saw him first and walked out to meet him. They didn't embrace. They simply nodded. Still standing, Thomas said. Red Elk gestured toward the smoke from the chimney. The fire keeps burning. They didn't speak of what had passed or what might come. Only what was. As the sun fell behind the hills, Red Elk disappeared once more. They never saw him again. But his presence lingered, in the traps Daniel learned to set, in the silent strength Eleanor carried like a second skin, in the fire that never died. One night in late summer, Eleanor walked the edge of the forest alone. The stars overhead shimmered like they had the night she fled into the snow months before. She paused by the same tree where she had once fallen, bruised and bleeding, where Thomas had lifted her into his arms. She knelt and pressed her palm to the earth. "Thank you," she whispered, not to God, not to the wind, but to the world for allowing her to survive. Back at the cabin, Thomas waited on the porch. Daniel sat beside him, carving a small wooden wolf with his knife. Eleanor joined them, settling between them in the warm hush of evening. "We could build another room," Thomas said after a while. "Daniel's growing fast. He'll need space." Eleanor smiled.
Yes.
"And maybe a second garden." Daniel looked up. "Can I have a dog?" Thomas chuckled. "One thing at a time." They sat in companionable silence. The fire crackled inside, and a lone owl called from the trees. The forest, once full of threat, now sang a lullaby. Eleanor leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder. "I thought my story ended that night in the snow," she murmured. "But I was wrong." He turned to her, his voice soft. "It was just the beginning." To everyone listening, still with us at this point, thank you. This story wasn't just about survival.
It was about healing.
About how even in the darkest places, the smallest act of kindness can spark something greater. A new beginning. A quiet redemption. If this story moved you, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Tell someone who needs to believe that healing is possible. That broken doesn't mean finished. It just means there's more story left to write.